So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon session. Before I get started, just a few housekeeping notes. A reminder, please share any comments, questions, thumbs ups, reactions, put them in the chat if you do have them as we go along. And questions should go either in the chat or the Q&A, which is in the More menu, okay? So now that that's out of the way, good afternoon and welcome to the High Accountability, High Engagement, Reducing Student Homelessness in Boston conversation. My name is Dr. Brandy Brooks, and I am the Executive Director of Boston's Higher Ground. This afternoon, I was supposed to be joined by my colleague and former Executive Director, now Advisor of Higher Ground, but he is under the weather. So in true collaborative fashion, even with our presentation, I will do my best to impart the knowledge and wisdom that he may have brought to this conversation this afternoon. So for the next 15, 20 minutes max, because I do want to give time and space for comments and questions, I will share the story of our collective impact initiatives and how we've been able to successfully reduce homelessness and shift policy in Boston, Massachusetts. Our goal over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so is for you to learn more about how we've done this, our kind of tricks and tools that we have used in terms of how we support students, homeless students and families, how we have worked and partnered with community providers, schools, families, funding partners, and really have a family-led approach with our initiatives. And also, I'll share a little bit about why cities in Massachusetts are reaching out to us and seeking advice, guidance, and even trying to collaborate with respect to the model we have created to address student homelessness. And by the end of our kind of session today, you'll learn a little bit more about some of the hard-earned lessons. Always folks want to paint the rosy picture, but it's not always rosy when you're doing collective impact work. So I'll share a little bit about some of the bumps and bruises along the way. So with that, let's journey together. We will start with the past, go into the present, and then envision a future of what we've been doing and what we hope to do. So thank you, Emily, for the next slide. So who we are and what we do. Again, I'm the Executive Director of Boston's Higher Ground. We are entering our 15th year this year. And 15 years ago, our founder, Hubie Jones, he envisioned a Boston where you had positive health and education outcomes for children in the Blue Hill corridor. For those not familiar with kind of the geography of Boston, that includes the Boston neighborhoods of Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan. And one of the things that he was grappling with at that time and frustrated by was the pace of improvement. He was just like, it's not happening fast enough for the community, for our children, for our families. And he really believes, even to this day, because he is still with us, 92 years young, but he felt that without equity of opportunity for all of Boston's children and families, how could we be a competitive and thriving city? And so, motivated by that question, he convened a group of 40 leaders to come together to really ask the question, what do you need? And then how can we help? And then they got to work on how to address it. And since our founding, we've really been focused on how do we create collective action so that we see outcomes with respect to education, housing, and health and wellness access. And very much so, staying true to our original purpose is centering parent and student voice in those conversations. And so we started with a challenge. And I always say that our family-led stability initiative and our collective impact initiative to support and provide housing for homeless students and families really started with righteous indignation. It started with a challenge. And often, as happens in many communities throughout our country, is there was research that had come out, there was a report that had come out that said, again, in this Blue Hill corridor that I mentioned, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, there was a lot of well-intentioned work happening, but the community was not seeing results with respect to education access, housing, and health and wellness. And so it started with that challenge, with that premise. And so Hubie, as Hubie does, is he said, well, we're not just going to helicopter in with what we think are the best solutions and things like that. We really need to listen to the community. And we need to start with community listening sessions. You know, my mom, she always says to me, even to this day, she's like, Brandy, you know, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Hirsch, sometimes, like, listen and observe way more than you speak and talk in meetings and things like that. And so that's where we started, was having community listening sessions. Hubie and our former executive director, Mosick, they went around to schools, to our local schools, to our local community providers, and to others to say, okay, what do we need here? And one issue rose to the top in all those conversations was, we need support on how to support our homeless students and families. We have kids coming into our classrooms that, for many reasons, because of their homelessness and housing insecurity, they are not able to concentrate. They are not able to learn. They are coming hungry and many other things. And because those students are impacted, it's also impacting the entire classroom, internal learning engagement. And so that's really the foundation of the idea of the family-led stability pilot at that time, was how do you partner with schools? How do you partner with local nonprofit partners? And then how do you get funding partners on board, legislators, everyone, to say, let's address and tackle this issue collectively? And so we started, our pilot project started with $100,000 grant. And we have grown to it now being over $1 million. But it started with a single idea, a group of individuals really committed to how do we address homelessness with our students. And one thing that was very important in the beginning and still remains important today is partner accountability. Something that was said very early and often in those meetings was, if we don't have outcomes, if we're not seeing kids being housed and then them remaining stably housed, what are we doing? And so we would have regular meetings, monthly meetings with city partners, nonprofit partners, funding partners were even invited to those monthly meetings, so that everybody stayed mindful of what are we focused and, you know, really attentive to. Next slide, Emily. So what has been our impact? As I said, it's a collaboration between the 4 nonprofit partners, 3 city agencies, and in the next slide, I'll share those partners. But we've been now doing this work since 2018. We did 2 years. The listening sessions was 2 years of work. So from 2016 to 2018, there was 2 years of listening, engaging with the community before we then launched the Family-Led Stability Initiative. And since that time in 2018, we as a collaborative have housed more than 575 students and their families from 18 partner schools. And we're on track over the next 3 years because, again, we've learned as we've gotten, you know, through this process, we're on track to house an additional 500 students and their families. Since the start of FY25, so our fiscal year runs from July 1 to June 30th, We have housed more than 35 students from 28 families this year. We're averaging about 2 to 3 students a month. And that is despite many challenges, which I'll talk about in just a second. Next slide, Emily. And so here's kind of our universe of schools that we are supporting in the Family-Led Stability Initiative. And as well, you see the key of our partners. So as I said, we have 3 other nonprofit partners, and those partners are Project Hope. They are a partner with us in terms of providing the direct service. So that we have full-time staff at Higher Ground and Project Hope that work directly with the families and students, because we do have unaccompanied young adults that are referred to us, until they are housed and up to 18 months after they've been housed. So Project Hope and Higher Ground are the direct service providers in this partnership. And then we have Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, or DSNI, as you see there. They are a referral partner in this work. And then there's New Lease for homeless families. They are another nonprofit partner, and their mission is that 1 out of every 4 units, they are a statewide organization, but 1 out of every 4 units that they have in the state of Massachusetts are prioritized for homeless students and families. And then we have our city partners, Boston Public Schools, Boston Housing Authority, and the Mayor's Office of Housing. And so that's kind of our universe in terms of the work we're doing and our 18 partner schools. So let me just briefly talk about the learnings. So one of the things that's very important in collective impact, and I know I'm preaching to the choir a bit here, is really being intentional about who needs to be at that table. And, you know, our Senator Edwards, she has a quote that says, you know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. But to extend that a little bit further is, if you're not invited to the table, sometimes you have to bring your own tables and your own utensils and your own meals. But it's really important, and it was really important for us in the beginning to really think about all partners that needed to be there. Schools, yes. They spend a lot of time, students, families spend a lot of time with schools, but we also need the nonprofit partners. Who's doing the work on the ground? And then we need to also make sure the funders know about this. And we need to have our legislators for some of the advocacy work, some of the resources that are needed. So that's very important. Another thing is keeping everyone engaged. This is hard work. This is intentional work, and it takes time. So how do you make sure partners are engaged? And one thing we've done very early at the onset is, yes, we have thought partners and everything like that, but we actually share resources with our partners. So there is funding attached to that as well. Another thing, and maybe it's apropos in the times that we are in now, is weathering the storms. Is, you know, one thing Hubie always would say is that, you know, administrations change locally, nationally, et cetera, but let's make sure Higher Ground is like the beacon, the lighthouse in terms of the work. And how do we make sure we weather those storms? Because they are going to come no matter what. And then something we have done and continue to do, focus on the long game. This will take years. And this actually goes into the next point. This is something we've done with funders too, because we all have funders, and some of them require quarterly reports, biannual reports, sometimes annual reports. But it's always important to even remind our funders, as well as our partners, that this takes a while. It is not going to happen overnight. And that's even conversations we've had to have with some of the families and students we support, is we understand you are in crisis, and we will be here with you through that. We will walk with you, walk alongside you, but this is a process, and nothing, particularly accessing housing right now, is going to be easy or short, but we will help you get housed. Just stick with us. And then the last piece, which I think is very important, is, and this is something we lead with, is giving grace and treating others with dignity. That's important, is that, I'm originally from the South, and one of the banks that I used in the South, they, no matter who you called, whether it was the business line or you called, for a regular teller, they would answer the phone, and they would always answer with, "How may I add value to your day today?" And I was just like, what? It's a bank. I mean, like, how you saying how you gonna add value? You gonna take my money? Like, what y'all doing? But but it has stuck with me, as you can tell. I'm using it today in this presentation. But I like to think about that in terms of how we lead. We need to lead with grace. We need to lead with that because, again, we are working with individuals when they are in crisis. We have had situations where we're picking up families at a bus station and they have all their belongings with us, or they have been asked to vacate their place they've been at for a while and they felt safe in. And so that's important, and I mean that not just from the families, the students we serve and work with, our partners, our funding partners, we need to think about that too, our legislators, those officials that we work with. And just in general, we really need to lead with grace and treat others, as we'd want to be treated. Old school. Next slide, Emily. And so with the next chapter, because we're in this interesting point. We're 15 years in, and yes, I see the questions coming in, and I will make sure to address them once we get to Q&A. But in the next chapter, one of the things that we will be working on, and again, it's a long-term process, but I put short and long-term, is that we really are focused on how can we continue some of our advocacy efforts? Because what we notice and what we recognize is that though we are helping and supporting a small slice of Massachusetts, housing insecurity, homelessness impacts every community throughout Massachusetts, throughout our nation. In Boston, we have over 5,300 homeless students. In Massachusetts, it's 31,000. In the United States, it's over 1 million. So what we're really focused on is how do we continue some of our advocacy efforts for how we address student homelessness? How do we create system change? Because, while we're the little Thomas engine, we really need support in terms of moving this forward. And how do we continue to collaborate, to share, to build those cross-sector partnerships that are needed with other housing advocates, education advocates, health advocates, justice advocates, to really figure out how to align and shift services. And then in terms of the long term, something we're really excited about, but it comes with challenges, is supporting and creating pathways for families, formerly homeless families that are now housed, to get on the home ownership pathway. And I'm proud to say that of the 575 students that we have housed and their families, 3 are now homeowners. So what our goal long-term is to have more on the homeownership pathway. And then lastly, before I open up to questions, is really thinking about system change outcomes, resource flows, policy changes, and other things that we can do. Just one quick example of a system change that we are in the process of impacting is our housing partner, Boston Housing Authority. Something they did because of their early involvement in our pilot phase of the project, so from 2018 to 2021, is they entered into an agreement with Boston Public Schools to offer vouchers to homeless students and families in the Boston Public Schools. And Boston Housing Authority is on record as saying this. As well, the Boston Teachers Union has advocated for some of the things that we've set forth in terms of how you support homeless students and families in their contracts and contract negotiations. So there's other ways that we are really focused on how do we change the system. And so I'll pause there. And I appreciate everyone for listening, engaging. I hope you learned a few nuggets. And so now we'll go into the Q&A with the last 10 minutes or so left. So I'm going to scan the chat here. And if you have a question, again, please put it in the chat so that we can answer it accordingly. And I see one of the questions here, it says about what's the narrow slice, or how do we look at the narrow slice of funding, right? So the best way that I can answer this question is, most of you who've applied to different grants and things like that, the grant will say, what specific program, right? So the proposal will, the questions will say, what specific program are you applying for that, you want to impact change for? And so that's what I said, is that some of the conversations we've had to have with funders, and we do see the shift happening now, is how can we have funding for collective impact and multi-year as well? So, any funding is important and it adds to the base in terms of serving the community. But how do we get multi-year funding, and how do we get funding that does collective impact? Because while we have a housing collective impact initiative, we also support education collective impact. Because again, the only reason why we do housing is to improve educational outcomes and economic resilience. So how do we get funders to be more attuned to that and really see the long term? And okay, next question is, did staff at Boston Higher Ground, did we conduct the community listening sessions ourselves, or did we contract with community partners? So there was no contracts in terms of the conversations. It was literally with the early days, Mosick and Hubie going around to the schools, and then the schools say, hey, this is a great idea. Let's have a meeting about this. And then the schools would, or the community center would say, okay, we're going to reach out to our community to have a session, and let's get the, people in the room. So that's kind of how the early community listening sessions started. It really was going to the community first to say, hey, we're this new organization. We heard there's some inequities with respect to these issues. What can we do? And then them saying, what? Let's get some people together, and we know the people. And so that's how it started. And then the question as well, do the housing vouchers require sobriety for families? There is not specific language with respect to sobriety necessarily, but there are requirements in terms of income and, depending on the situation, it depends on family background, but no, it's not a sobriety thing. And we have in the state of Massachusetts, there are, of course, the federal vouchers, MRVPs, and then there are state vouchers available as well. And you have project-based versus the mobile. So, lots of ways I can go in that question. And another question came in is the outcomes. Can you share how you arrived at some specific metrics, to guide your work? And what was the process like? Did any of your partners, funders, board members assist? Absolutely. Initially, in terms of Higher Ground, our board was instrumental in literally us keeping the doors open. Because again, we started with collective impact and with $100,000, right? That was our seed money to the organization we are now. So board was absolutely critical. And we still have board members that were with us from the very first days to now. And even one of our team members that is on the call now, Emily, has been with us since the very first day. And so in terms of specific metrics, that was a combination of partners looking at, okay, so what are the things that we need for reporting purposes, right? So there's some things that we need for reporting purposes, but then what are the things we're really interested in and engaged in? So for reporting purposes, numbers. So how many students housed, which schools did they attend, which areas did the family live in or were sheltered in before versus when they were housed in their semi-permanent. Because again, we're very place-based focused. So our focus is on making sure families get access to housing in the communities in which their kids go to school, in which they have their social network. So that's part of like some of the like reporting metrics, but then there's other metrics that we're really interested in and engaged in around stability, housing stability. So we want to know, well, once you are housed, how many families stay stably housed? How many need to, go back and access services? And also with our partner, Boston Housing Authority, we're really looking at economic resilience because families that are housed in Boston Housing Authority units, every year they have to do an annual income recertification. So something we're very interested in and they're interested in too is, does the income improve for the family? Does the health improve? So again, but that's not necessarily something that is part of kind of the metrics on our funder aspect, but it's something we're deeply interested in and engaged in. We all live in this community and we want to see families and students thriving in the community. And okay, so next question is, what is the long-term vision? Given that there are more than 5,300 homeless students, and what are the barriers to scaling up? So long-term vision is that we continue to increase partners. We continue to increase the advocacy for the resources. And that's everything from access to units, access to vouchers, access to arrearages support. So those families that get behind in rent, so that we can prevent them from getting home, from becoming homeless or being one of the families we support. So I think that's very important to us. And then in terms of barriers to scaling up, there are a few and many. When we look at housing in general, particularly affordable housing, let me make that caveat, is that the demand right now outpaces the supply. So that is going to be a constant barrier. Another barrier is, access to the resources to help support families and help them stay stably housed. Vouchers, units and other things like that. I know, there's been a lot of conversations about federal support and, what may happen in terms of that over the next year or 2 years or 3 years or even longer than that. So those will be barriers. But for us, one of the things we remain focused on is that regardless of the barriers, we got to continue to do the work, continue to, in the words of John Lewis, get in good trouble, necessary trouble for the soul of this nation. We got to continue to do this work despite the barriers. But there are barriers, and we anticipate there will be other barriers we're not thinking of right now in the future. But we just continue to stay focused on the work, continue to stay focused on the outcomes, focus on the intentionality, and always center that student and family voice. It hasn't led us wrong to this day. And one last question here, and I apologize if I couldn't get it to everybody, but the last slide, Emily, if you'll advance, has my contact information so you can reach out. What have been 2 of your most important advocacy wins? So one absolutely has been the partnership with Boston Housing Authority in terms of them recognizing the work that we're doing and saying, you know what, based on their work and their success, Higher Ground and our other collective family-led stability partners, we need to set aside these vouchers for these families, because with support, families can get housed and they can work through this malaise in this system. So that was one. And then the second one, I would say in terms of advocacy, has been some of our collective impact work with cities and networks outside of Boston and conversations that we have had with those networks that center around how can they also have similar HUD-approved policies that prioritize homeless students and families when it comes to affordable units. So I think, small wins are important. As Hubie always says, hit enough singles, you'll get some runs in. So that's kind of the focus. And I apologize, I couldn't get to everyone's questions. But again, if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And I thank you for joining. I thank you for participating. And I hope you learned just a little bit this afternoon.